Welcome to the Accessible Learning Experience, where we help you turn learning barriers into learning opportunities. In this episode, we conclude our three-part conversation with CAST co-founders Skip Stahl and David Rose as they reflect on how the long history of working accessibility continues to inspire and inform the work of the Technical Assistance Centers at CAST. And stay tuned until the end to hear the recollections of the many contributions our colleague Joy Zabala made to the work of those centers, and how you can contribute to the Joy Zabala Fellowship to remember Joy and build on her legacy in the areas of assistive technology and accessible educational material. Here's AIM Center Director Cynthia Curry with Skip Stahl and David Rose.
The story of the national file format that led to the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standard, or NIMAS, shows how CAST built consensus among an extensive group of stakeholders with widely diverse self-interests, but with a common goal of serving learners with disabilities. It was also CAST's foray into informing policy, in this case, the reauthorization of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 2004. And thinking back to David's reflection in the first episode of this series, I can't help but draw a parallel between the innovation that drove CAST product development in the 80s and 90s with the policy innovation behind NIMAS in the early 2000s. And the vision of access for all continues to guide product development and policy advocacy to this day. Let's turn our attention to the technical assistance centers that were originally established by the Department of Education to support the implementation of NIMAS. Skip, tell us about the evolution of these centers at CAST.
In the early days, the primary focus was print. Print instructional materials were the predominant media of the classroom, basically any classroom. But over the intervening years, obviously that has changed significantly. And the magic of digital file formats, creating flexible versions of otherwise kind of page-bound print materials, has also brought with it considerable challenges, because the embracement and the development of digital materials kind of let the genie out of the bottle, and not only do we get highly accessible versions and the potential to create things that are fully accessible from the get-go, or born accessible, if you will, is also accompanied by the fact that prototypes and ultimately highly widely distributed materials can be created that are totally inaccessible to a various group of learners and can permeate classrooms. So I think there's the lessons we've learned around print have served us well, and I think we have a very effective now solution for print instructional materials with NIMAS, particularly for K-12. Originally, it was thought that if we had 3,000 to 5,000 NIMAS file sets that were available to be transformed into student-ready versions for students with disabilities, that we would be in a terrific place. We probably now have close to 50 or 60,000 of those file sets available at the National Repository, the NIMAC, the National Instructional Materials Access Center, and those can be drawn down by qualified alternate media producers and then distributed to qualifying students. So we have this, the vision that we had years ago of a centralized solution exists for print textbooks in K-12 settings. But the reality is today, even at the kindergarten level, tablets are being distributed to students, and apps are being used, and web resources are being accessed by educators across the spectrum. And we need to continue to monitor that process to identify where those devices, materials, and practices are excluding learners and students with disabilities, because they weren't designed with those students in mind. They were designed with the kind of hypothetical average kid, the same kind of mistaken design approach that challenged, created some of the print-based challenges. So I think that in many ways the situation is better and equally challenging simultaneously. The kind of proliferation of digital instructional materials and the fact that a lot of the acquisition of these materials can occur at the classroom level, with teachers bringing in apps or finding something and saying, oh, this is cool, let's try this. That we need to look at the aspects of the NIMS work that are centralized and kind of a national approach, and see if there are similar things that can be applied to digital learning materials and environments. And obviously there's statutory expectations, civil rights for equitable access, and including kids with special needs in curriculum materials decision making. But it's because the materials themselves are so fluid and distinct, being digital, and they may come in multimedia formats, audio, tactile, visual, and just a variety of different media types. I think the challenge is pretty significant to try and figure out. So the one, for example, that I'm concerned about is what happens to Braille in the digital age, particularly for young blind kids that learning Braille early on in the schooling process. So starting in, with some aspects of kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, will give those students a leg up if they become skilled and fluent in both Braille reading and Braille writing, because it just gives them access to a literate environment that will prove to be exceptionally useful. However, increasingly we're seeing the influx of digital instructional materials into those early schooling environments, and many of those materials are not available in a Braille format or don't lend themselves to a Braille format. So now you have the circumstance, potential threat is that young blind students are going to be constrained in what instructional materials they have access to and what materials they use, and that maybe they're only able to use 20% of the curriculum materials that their sighted classmates have access to on a regular basis. And so are we creating a whole nother area of discrimination embedded in the flexibility of what's being offered the sighted kids versus what's being offered those students who need a different format, more tactile, more audio, whatever. I think those are real problems and challenges. I don't know of any. I think Braille is incredibly important, particularly in the early years for kids who are young students who are blind, just for its expressive extensions and as well as receptive. So being able to write and discourse in ways other than audio. And so if we, and we're talking about a very small subset of the population. So again, I just worry that from a commercial perspective, there's no market there for the creation of Braille materials. And there probably needs to be some sort of, on the one hand, which you can refer to as compulsory licensing, where a producer of instructional materials is required to provide at least some of those materials to the producers of Braille so that Braille can be produced, and that compulsory licensing is kind of a no-cost requirement, which can be quite effective because on the other and protective of the intellectual rights holders, the producers and the publishers, because we're talking about a very small subset of students who will use that other format. But it's simple to make the argument for that. It's very difficult to do it technologically, because we're talking about interactive media that may branch to other types of interactive media that may involve audio, video, and text elements, and how do you sort those out? So I think I know the AIM Center and its supporters are addressing these issues and trying to identify where are the sweet spots for creating standards, specifications, and policies that can benefit not only just one classroom but every classroom. And it just goes. It's going to go back to the consensus building and shared solution finding. Or shared problem identification that drove the NIMUS work, I think is going to evolve within the digital environment as well.
So, Skip, the challenge that the NIMUS addresses, as well as a lot of these other solutions that came out of the national file format and the provision of accessible instructional materials, really is tied to a subset of students who not only need an accessible format, they cannot access or use print materials, or as you've indicated, certain digital instructional materials that include static text. And they also need to be eligible through copyright. So a lot of the conversations, a lot of the problem solving has been around a subset of students. But in this whole process, CAST really has flexed its UDL muscles in strategic and advantageous ways. And I heard you talk about the market and influencing the market. Can you say a little bit more about how this solution and the consensus building and the work that CAST has done in this area really has had wider implications for teaching, learning, and all students?
I think that what CAST has done really originated at looking at, if you can imagine a graphic of a bell curve, and we initially realized that if we could create solutions for those learners at opposite ends of the bell curve, so where the curve starts to slope down to the horizontal line, and we know there are very few students out there on either end of the bell curve. There might be some kids with significant autism at one end and kids with significant attention issues or sensory motor or visual hearing on the other. If we can address the needs of those students, we begin to go a long way to addressing the needs of students as you get towards the middle of the bell curve, where there are many more learners, a number of whom may have no apparent or documented disabilities whatsoever, but simply different ways of learning. And I think that what's happened over the years is we've realized that many solutions that have been specifically devised for learners with disabilities have ended up getting adopted by the mainstream environment because they simply were better than what existed before. And one of my favorite examples was looking about closed captioning on TV. And prior to the Americans with Disabilities Act, closed captioning on TV was the responsibility of a deaf TV watcher. They had to go out and buy a decoder box, and it might cost them a couple $100, and then they had to hunt around for channels that were actually creating an audio track that would provide captions, etc. And so it was on the individual at that point. And with the passage of the ADA and associated other acts related to technology and accessibility for the common good, closed caption decoders were required as part of, you want to sell a television in this country, there has to be a decoder chip involved. And so all of a sudden, the cost went from hundreds of dollars to pennies because of the economy of scale. And so there was a survey done a number of years ago to determine whether or not this approach was effective. And the survey was particularly targeting individuals who were deaf. How many of them are using decoder boxes or the decoder chips embedded in the television, and could we use this approach for other things? So the number one use of closed captioning in this country is couples in bed at night where one wants to watch TV and the other wants to sleep. And the second most popular use of closed captioning is in sports bars. And the third most popular use is in places like airports. And by the time you get through the list of that survey, it turns out that use by individuals who are deaf of hard of hearing is down around item number 10. So for me, it was a great example of a particular adaptation that was deemed to be very important to a subset of the population that was successfully co-opted by the population in general because it offered options that simply didn't occur otherwise. And people said, wow, I don't need this, but it's sure nice to have it. Because if in the absence of this, then life becomes more complicated and you lose access to things. So I think there are multiple examples of that type that exist. And it's certainly clear to us and been clear to us over the years that accommodations that have been built in to address challenges faced by learners end up being successfully adopted by learners who don't have any of those challenges, but simply realize this is a better opportunity, better way of doing things. I remember early on, for example, when spell checkers were kind of new in the word processing world, and people would say, "Oh, it's a crutch. You can't let kids use spell checkers because they'll never learn how to spell." It turned out the exact opposite is true. I mean, if you are having trouble with medial vowels or consonant diagraphs when you're writing, and you have a word like license, you always misspell. If your spell checker corrects you 25 times in a row that you've misspelled license, usually by time 26 you're spelling it correctly because it's simply popping up and repeating and saying, here's a challenge that you need to address. And I think that that's kind of emblematic of the types of supports that we initially assumed would not be beneficial, but turned out to be enormously beneficial for a variety of learners. And so it became clear to us that the work we had done early on, addressing those students at the far end of the bell curve, and creating environments for learners with very distinct and challenging needs and addressing barriers that really needed to be overcome, that in doing that process, we created opportunities for other students who simply weren't struggling with those barriers, but looked at it and went, this is a better way of doing things. It's better to have these options than not to have them. So I think that the access piece was really a stepping stone to addressing the kind of diversity that exists in how people learn and acquire information, and providing an increased array of tools for that to happen.
Let's talk about the technical assistance centers. Can you talk about the evolution of the technical assistance centers and some of the highlights of that work, and just how technical assistance at CAST has really influenced the organization and elevated its prominence, it's particularly within the Department of Education and the Office of Special Education Programs, and the partnerships that have evolved out of that?
Yeah, I think, as I had mentioned previously, we were sought after for our understanding of learners' accessibility, kind of diversity within the learning process. After we had worked with a variety of individuals who had significant challenges, and school districts were looking for some guidance and some support, as were publishers, curriculum publishers. David had mentioned WiggleWorks, just a variety of different investments that the organization made on both ends of the equation around, or all ends of the equation around learning and instructional practices. And so it became clear that we viewed curriculum as kind of multifaceted, that had four components. It had standards, assessments, materials, and instructional practices. And we developed some expertise in each of those areas, that it became it was important to us to realize that you couldn't really address changing curriculum within a classroom, a school, a state, or a country if you didn't address each of those components. That there's assessment is a critical factor, the whole process of setting standards initially, and then how do you measure, benchmark student goal towards those standards if you don't have fully kind of universally designed assessment practices. And if you have universally designed assessment practices, well, you probably better have instructional materials that relate to those, and instructional practices that also relate to those. So this is more of a fabric than individual components, and we felt we developed principles and practices in each of those areas, and then others would look to us for some guidance and recommendations on how to incorporate some of that work. So the current AIM Center, for example, has quality indicators. So we developed kind of strategies and schemes that could be replicated, that were things that we felt we could give to the educational community, and what we needed obviously was some way of supporting the efforts that went into the development of those structures and schemes, and so when we would compete for funding, for competitive grant funding from the U.S. Department of Education or other departmental agencies, it was really with that in mind. How do we create scalable expectations and practices, and then share those out with constituent groups as broadly as possible? And I think that was an orientation that resonated well with funding agencies. That what we were really saying is, we have some ideas we think are worth sharing. We think they're scalable. We think they're supportable across a variety of environments. So if we have the funds to do that, we will step up to the plate and make sure that happens. And I think in those curriculum areas, the standards, assessment, materials, and practices, we developed the expertise to do that, and the reputation in the field as being responsive to the sites with whom we were working. I think one of the hallmarks that's always struck me about our approach to doing things, particularly around technical assistance, that made it different from every other entity, was that I think in most situations when we were requested to assist an institution or an entity or a site, that we went in assuming that the work that was being done there, that the people were doing the absolute best job they could, given the understanding, knowledge, and tools that they had available to them. And that was somewhat of a unique perspective, because oftentimes you have technical assistance providers or professional development people come in and say, well, I know what you're doing now, but that's really wrong, so we'll tell you how to do it right. And that doesn't really, help when you go in with an attitude like that. And I think we took an entirely different approach and just said, we're assuming you're doing the best possible job you can, given what you know, and given the tools you have available to you, and there may be alternatives that will work for you, and we'll explore that collaboratively together to see if that's in fact the case. And so we went in with an expectation, I think, that we were going to learn as much from them as they were going to learn from us, and that we were simply had two separate kind of skill sets that we were going to bring together to do what we could do together that was better than either one of us could do independently. And I think by having that level of respect be right up front, that our technical assistance has proven to be extraordinarily successful and in demand of people saying, we really want to work with you because we've talked to others who have worked with you, and they like the way you work, and they like the fact that you come in with a area, both with expertise but with a level of respect. And I think that's kind of a good reflection on the kind of ethos and approach of the organization in general.
You tell us a little bit about Joy's influence on that approach. What role did Joy have as a technical assistance leader at CAST in pioneering these approaches and methods of TA?
Well, Joy was a force of nature to begin with. Joy was the ultimate collaborator. She lived for working jointly or in a group setting with others. And Joy had very strong opinions and a strong sense, a passion for helping others, particularly young learners with disabilities. And yet she also realized that there was an inherent structure in which all of us functioned. There's a community, a social environment. Joy came to CAST having developed a framework called SETT, SETT, which stood for Student Environment Task and Tools. And it was about assistive technology because one of the kind of seductive aspects of assistive technology is it can look like a panacea right out of the box. All of a sudden you can say something and the computer starts typing the words for you, and you go, oh, this is the answer to every student who has trouble or can't use their hands to type. Well, Joy would kind of step back and say, you know what? First of all, we have to identify what potential and limits does the student bring to the situation. What environment is the student working in? Because frankly, each environment may be different. What they need at home, what they need at school, what they need, at the beginning of the day versus what they need at the end of the day, very different. Then what's the task? What are we asking them to do? How extensive is it? How located is it? How broad? How narrow? And then finally, then we should think about, what the tools are. I think that whole framework is predicated on a level of discussion, partnership, and collaboration that you can't effectively employ the SETT framework unless you have 7 or 8 people contributing to that discussion, because the person who knows the student may be very different than the person who is overseeing the environment in which that student is learning. The task may be articulated by a curriculum committee or someone in a totally different area, and the tool set may be the purview of assistive technology specialists. So now we've got a commitment to group learning around this particular student. So I think that framework that Joy developed, which is used throughout the country today, is absolutely the right framework. She initiated it by her concern that because assistive technology was so seductive, that people were going to be immediately going to the tool and saying, let's make this tool work for this student now, when in fact you need to go through the process of SETT. And she brought that orientation to CAST of that. She and I worked together for almost 30 years, and it was very clear to me that her level of consensus building, collaboration, and commitment to shared work was the same as mine and the same as what went on at CAST. And that she was a holistic thinker. It was just that she'd look at society as a whole and individuals within it and acknowledge that both of those views were equally important. And so I think that because of her passion, her ability to speak up when others would remain silent was Joy. Joy never liked a conversation void. So if there was a lull in the conversation, Joy would be certain to say something right then. And in most of those cases, what she was saying was either, if it was tangential, it was appropriately tangential, but most of the time it was right on. And it would push people to address and engage in ways that they might not otherwise do. she would be famous for, if you were jointly presenting with her, she'd turn to you at some point and ask you to take over something that you hadn't discussed previously, and you'd look at her for a moment and go, "Oh, of course," And I think I've shared this a number of times, but she and I were doing a presentation together years ago at Council for Exceptional Children in Vancouver. I believe it was 2000, and she was her area was assistive technology. She was not a CAST. She was not employed by CAST at that time. Mine was Universal Design for Learning, and we had entitled it uh, letters from the same alphabet or something like that. So I was talking about UDL, she was talking about assistive technology. And then midway through the presentation, I started talking about assistive technology and she started talking about UDL. And we literally swapped focus roles. And it wasn't until after we finished the presentation, somebody from the audience came up and said, "Wow, that was really cool what you guys did. Have just switched what your area of focus midway through the conversation, the presentation." And we kind of looked at each other and went, "We did? Oh," and ended up being a kind of show that we ended up doing numerous times because it worked effectively, and it was just a way of showing that assistive technology was a component of UDL, that it was really a tool to move the UDL framework forward. So she will be sorely missed, for sure.
Just quick, I remember the first time I came into contact with her was I had given a talk somewhere, and I had, half a room full. And I thought that was pretty good. We were still fairly early. And I walked out of the room feeling pretty proud of myself and like maybe we'll go somewhere. And I walked out into the hall, and there was down the hall, there was a room where people were out in the hall, and it filled the entire hall trying to get into the room. And I'm like, what the heck is that? And so I went down the hall and looked in, and I didn't know who she was. But there she was, holding forth, and the audience was just, completely adoring her. And I remember thinking, I don't know who this Joy is, but I'm going to start taking her courses. And I want to hire her when we're big enough. And it was wonderful when she finally, we did make the connection. It was, I thought it was one of the best honors of our history that Joy joined us. It honored us, truthfully.
David and Skip, on behalf of a truly grateful nation of educators, students, and families, thanks to the two of you and to Chuck and Joy. Together, you pioneered, established, and set CAST on a path to sustain accessibility as a non-negotiable component of best practices and the measure of any high-quality education. Your legacies are firmly cemented. And a final note in recognition of Joy, who left us far too soon. The Joy Zabala Fellowship in Assistive Technology and Accessible Educational Materials celebrates Joy's life and the impact of her 40-plus year career in promoting inclusion for learners with disabilities. To learn more and to donate, please visit the homepage of the AIM Center's website, aem.cast.org.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Accessible Learning Experience, brought to you by the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials at CAST. You can find us on the web at aem.cast.org. There you'll find show notes with links to all of the resources mentioned on each episode. Thanks again for listening, and remember, accessibility is everyone's responsibility. The contents of this podcast were developed under a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of Education. However, those contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the U.S. Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government.